He threw it in the trash, without even looking at it. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just stared as my son laughed at the gift I wrapped with trembling hands, my father's gold watch, the same one that built this family. Then he leaned closer and said, "You're too old to manage anything now, let's clean up the estate." And that's when I saw it, the eviction notice, my name on it, my address. 30 days to leave my own home. But what Mark didn't know? That watch wasn't the only thing his grandfather passed down. The moment he signed that loan in my name, he triggered a clause he never read. Now the clock's ticking. For him. My name is Raymond Whitaker, and I'm 75 years old. Most mornings I sit at my kitchen table by 5 a.m., watching steam rise from my coffee, while my rental's paperwork catches the dawn light. My youngest son, Mark, once my proudest hope for the family. Business only visits when he needs something signed. His charm flows like honey, but there's a sharpness behind those practiced smiles that reminds me of a circling hawk. What Mark doesn't know is that his mother, Eleanor, God rest her soul, made me revise our family trust before she passed. My brother-in-law Richard, who's handled our accounts for 30 years, called it my quiet backbone, those carefully worded pages tucked away in my study. This Father's Day morning, I wrapped my own father's gold watch with trembling fingers, hoping it might bridge the growing silence between us. But let me start from the beginning. I'd spent that Sunday morning setting Eleanor's best china on the table, each plate aligned just so, the way she always insisted. You know those little rituals that stick with you. Even now I could hear her voice. "Raymond, dear, the fork goes on the left." Those delicate blue flowers around the edges caught the morning light streaming through our kitchen windows, making the whole room feel like a painting come to life. The bacon was crackling in the pan. I've always believed a good breakfast starts with that sound. When I heard Mark's car pull up, he was 20 minutes late as usual. Ever notice how some folks wear tardiness like a badge of honor? Through the window, I watched him climb out of that gleaming BMW he couldn't really afford, designer sunglasses still on despite the early hour. He had that strut of his, the one that showed up right after his first big commission check. My other two kids were already inside, helping with last-minute preparations, but Mark, he was working the driveway like a red carpet, calling out to the neighbors who'd joined us for brunch. "Mr. Peterson, how's that golf swing?" he shouted across the yard. "Mrs. Davis looking lovely as ever." All charm, no substance, like watching a politician at a fundraiser. When he finally made it inside, he barely glanced my way before launching into some story about his latest business deal. The other guests leaned in, hanging on every word while my daughter Sarah rolled her eyes behind her coffee cup. The familiar weight of the velvet box in my pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. I waited until everyone had filled their plates. The gentle clink of Eleanor's china, a counterpoint to Mark's booming voice. My hands weren't as steady as I'd have liked when I pulled out that small box, but some things are worth doing even if they shake you a bit. "Son," I said, pushing the box across the table, "this was your grandfather Harold's." The conversation around us dimmed. He wore it every day of his working life, and it never lost a minute. Mark barely paused his story about some hotshot investor. He flipped open the lid with one hand, barely glancing at the gleaming gold watch inside. The same watch I'd polished that morning, remembering how it had kept time through 40 years of my father's own business dealings. "Antiques are for museums, Dad," he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Then, without even taking it out of the box, he tossed it sideways into the kitchen trash. The metallic thud against the plastic bin echoed through the suddenly silent room. Have you ever felt time stop? Not like in the movies, but in that horrible way where every second stretches out like taffy and you're aware of every tiny detail. I could see Sarah's knuckles go white around her fork, could hear Richard clear his throat, could feel the weight of all those averted eyes. Mark just kept talking, something about modernizing the family business, his voice too loud for the hushed room. "We need to think bigger, folks, out with the old, in with the new, that's what I always say." My fingers trembled as I started gathering plates, though most were still half full. "Perhaps we should clear the table," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. The guests couldn't leave fast enough, murmuring polite excuses that fooled nobody. Once they'd gone, I carried that kitchen trash bag out to the garage, holding it carefully like it might break. Through the thin white plastic I could make out the shape of the velvet box, tipped on its side against some coffee grounds. My father's voice echoed in my memory, A man's word is like this watch, Ray. It either keeps true time or it doesn't. I set the bag aside gently. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. Better to wait, to speak with Mark privately in the study. Sometimes, wisdom isn't about what you say, but when you say it. Taking 3 deep breaths, another habit Eleanor taught me, I turned back toward the house. The study door was already closed, and I could hear Mark's footsteps inside. As I reached for the knob, I heard it click shut behind him. The study door clicked behind me as I stepped inside. Mark had already planted himself between the heavy oak desk and the doorway, his shoulders taking up more space than necessary. Late afternoon sun striped the oriental rug Eleanor had picked out 20 years ago, turning dust motes into floating gold. "Let's talk business, Dad," he said, pulling out a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "The Oak Street rental. It's time to transfer that deed over to me." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. "And why would I do that?" He gave me that smile, the one that appeared whenever he thought he was being clever. "Come on, you're 75. You don't need the hassle of managing tenants anymore. It's dead weight at your age." The same hands that had replaced every window in that house, installed new water heaters, and fixed countless leaky faucets curled into fists at my sides. I could still smell the fresh paint from last month's touch-up job. "Those tenants have been with us for 12 years, I said quietly. "The Hendersons have never missed a payment. Your mother wanted the rental income streams kept separate, you know that." "Mom's not here anymore," he shot back, leaning forward onto the desk. The wood creaked under his weight. "And speaking of paperwork, I had a chat with Attorney Collins yesterday about cleaning up the estate, making things more efficient." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Collins was my lawyer, had been for 30 years. "You did what?" "Just exploring options." He shrugged, but his eyes were sharp. He mentioned something about simplifying the trust structure. You know, streamlining things before they get complicated. I drew in a slow breath, tasting copper on my tongue. The same taste I'd get before firing someone who'd been stealing from the company. "That conversation wasn't yours to have, Mark. Collins works for me, not you." "Dad." "No." I held up one hand. "This discussion is over. Go, cool off. We'll talk when you're thinking clearer." His jaw worked back and forth, but he straightened up from the desk. "You're making a mistake," he said, but moved toward the door. I waited until his footsteps faded before letting my shoulders drop. The house was quieting now, front door opening and closing as the last guests made their excuses. Sarah's voice drifted up from the kitchen, probably saying goodbye to the Petersons. "You ever notice how a house feels different when it's emptying out? Like it's exhaling after holding its breath too long?" I made my way back to the garage, needing to check something. The kitchen trash bag was right where I'd left it, and when I pressed gently against the side, I felt the solid shape of the velvet box. Someone had thrown paper napkins on top, trying to hide it maybe. Carefully, I slid the bag into a corner behind some paint cans. After dark, when the house was properly quiet, I'd come back and rescue Dad's watch. The hallway was dim when I came back inside, shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. A piece of paper on the hall table caught my eye, crisp white against the dark wood. Even from a few steps away, I recognized Mark's handwriting scrawled across the top margin. My feet felt heavy as I moved closer. Sometimes you know something bad is coming, but you have to look anyway. Like watching storm clouds roll in when you've got hay down in the field. The paper waited there, innocent as a snake in the grass, while the last sounds of departing cars faded from the driveway. I unfolded the paper with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. The letterhead was from one of those legal template websites, "Notice to vacate premises," in bold black letters across the top. My address, the home I'd lived in for 43 years, was typed out in crisp computer font below it. But what made my throat close up was seeing my own name listed as the party being told to leave. Mark's handwriting crowded the margins, 30 days standard timeline, and check state requirements for senior residents. He'd circled something about reasonable accommodation and drawn an arrow to a note that read, "Collins can expedite." You know that feeling when your mind refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing? Like when Eleanor first showed me her hospital scan results, and all I could do was blink at the images, willing them to change. The grandfather clock in the foyer, Eleanor's mother's clock, ticked away with sharp little clicks that seemed to get louder with each passing second. Heat crept up my neck while I read through the template a second time, then a third. Each word felt like a small betrayal, lined up in neat rows on the page. My hands were shaking, but I managed to open my phone's camera and take several clear shots of the document, making sure to capture Mark's notes in the margins. Created a new folder called Mark Documents and saved them there. 40 years running a business teaches you to keep records of everything, even the things that burn to look at. I hit Richard's number on speed dial. He picked up on the second ring. "Ray, everything okay?" "Need you to come by," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not now, early tomorrow. Bring coffee and that legal pad you always carry." A pause. Richard had been my brother-in-law long enough to read between my words. "Dawn work for you? I'll stop by Miller's Diner for their breakfast blend." "Perfect." I hesitated, then added, "Things with Mark? They're worse than we thought." "I'll be there," he said simply, and hung up. The garage was dark when I went back out, but I knew exactly where I'd tucked that trash bag. Funny how some muscle memories never fade. My hands found the velvet box easily, just like they used to find Eleanor's hand under the covers on cold mornings. I carried the watch to the kitchen sink, running a soft dishcloth under warm water. The gold case was scratched but intact. Dried egg from brunch had stuck to one side, and something sticky, maple syrup maybe, had gotten into the crown. But as I worked carefully with the damp cloth, the metal began to warm and shine. The second hand had stopped, probably from the impact. I wound it gently, counting the turns like Dad had taught me. "Never more than 7, his voice echoed in my memory. "Treat it with respect and it'll run true." After a few seconds, the hand stuttered, then picked up its steady march around the face. The study drawer still held all my important papers, insurance policies, property deeds, the trust documents Eleanor had insisted we review every year. I laid the watch beside them, its soft ticking a counterpoint to the grandfather clock's deeper voice. Through the study windows, I saw headlights sweep across the curtains as Mark's car backed out of the driveway. The engine revved once, showing off for nobody, before the sound faded down the street. I turned the key in the study door's lock, then settled into Eleanor's old reading chair. She'd picked it for the way it faced both the window and the desk, claiming she could keep an eye on both the birds and the bills. The leather still held a hint of her lavender hand cream, or maybe that was just my imagination. Sitting there, I started calculating what Mark thought he could take. The Oak Street rental was just the beginning. That much was clear now. But he didn't know about the trust's special provisions, the ones Eleanor had written in during that last year. He saw an old man with assets to grab, not the businessman who'd built everything from scratch. The next morning, my front porch looked like it always did at dawn, dew beading on the railing, Mrs. Peterson's sprinklers hissing 2 doors down. But nothing felt normal. I'd barely slept, my mind running circles like a truck with bad brakes. Richard's Buick rolled up, right as the first cardinals started their morning debate in the maple trees. He climbed the steps, carrying 2 paper cups from Miller's and a worn leather binder I recognized from our annual tax reviews. "You look like hell, Ray," he said, handing me the coffee. "Feel worse?" I settled into one of the white wicker chairs Eleanor had insisted would make the porch more welcoming. Remember when Mark was 10, and I caught him trying to forge my signature on his report card? Richard sat down, already flipping through his binder. "Let me guess, he's graduated to bigger papers." "You could say that." I pulled out my phone, showing him the photos of the eviction notice. "Found this yesterday after the watch incident. But there's more." The coffee went cold while I laid it all out. Mark's demand for the Oak Street property, his casual mention of talking to Collins, the whole ugly scene in the study. Richard listened, making notes in his precise accountant's handwriting, stopping me only to clarify details. "Show me everything he's touched in the last month," he said finally. "Every document, every conversation about money or property, even stuff that seemed innocent at the time." The morning air was getting sticky as Richard sketched out boxes on his legal pad, drawing lines between them like some kind of financial family tree. Trucks connected to titles, titles linked to possible liens, question marks sprouting everywhere. "We need to check your bank activity," he said, "and any messages from vendors. Better do it before business hours get busy." I pulled up the trucking company's account on my phone, something I'd done 1,000 times before. But this time there was a little red flag I'd never seen. "What's that?" I pointed to the screen. Richard leaned in, squinting. His finger traced down a column of dates, then flipped back to some credit report summaries in his binder. The pen in his hand circled something. First National's logo, hard enough to leave an indent on the next page. "Call your branch manager," he said. "Now." You ever notice how time moves different when you're dreading something? My fingers felt stiff as I pulled up Sandra Chen's direct line. She'd helped set up the company's first fleet loan 20 years ago. "Ray, I was actually going to call you today." Sandra's voice had that careful tone bank managers use when they're walking on eggshells. "We've got a question about a recent application." "Sandra, hold that thought. Let me put you on speaker. I've got Richard Hayes here with me." "Oh good, your accountant's there. Give me just a moment. I've got another call coming in." The hold music kicked in, some jazzy piece that made my skin crawl. Through the phone's speaker, we heard a muffled greeting from Sandra's end. "First National, this is Sandra Chen." "Yes, Mr. Whitaker, I have those documents right here." Richard's head snapped up. My stomach dropped. We both knew I was already on her line. The music clicked off. "Ray, sorry about that. Listen, we need to verify your signature on a loan application that came in last week. The amount is substantial, and given our long relationship..." Richard was already writing furiously, making a list of what looked like document requests. My coffee cup shook slightly as I set it down on the porch rail. "What kind of loan are we talking about, Sandra?" The late morning heat had turned my Cadillac into an oven, even with the AC cranked. Richard rode shotgun, quiet except for the rustle of papers he kept checking in the file crate we'd buckled into the back seat. You know that. Silence that fills a car when everyone's thinking the same heavy thoughts. That's what followed us all the way to First National. "You ready for this?" Richard asked as we pulled into a spot near the entrance. I nodded, though my throat felt like I'd swallowed sand. "Let's see what my son's been up to." The bank lobby hadn't changed much since Eleanor and I got our first business loan here. Same marble floors, same landscape paintings, same smell of paper and money and other people's worry. Sandra Chen met us at the door, professional as always in her navy blazer, but I caught the concern in her eyes. "Ray, Richard, let's use the conference room." She gestured toward one of those glass boxes where they deliver bad news in air-conditioned comfort. "I'll have Melissa bring the file." I remember watching my father sign papers at this same bank 40 years ago, his hands steady as he built his own dreams. Now here I was signing an affidavit just to look at forgeries of my own signature. Funny how life circles back on you, isn't it? Melissa, a young teller with kind eyes, brought in a sealed envelope like she was handling evidence, which I suppose she was. Sandra laid out the documents one by one. Application forms, credit line agreements, fleet title listings that made my stomach turn. Then came the personal guarantee page with that signature that was almost mine but not quite. Richard pulled out some old tax returns from his crate, laying them side by side with the loan papers. He studied the strokes of each signature, using his pen as a pointer. After a minute, he just shook his head slowly. "The slant's wrong," he said quietly. "Ray's W always kicks up at the end. This one drags." Sandra's voice stayed steady, clinical, like a doctor describing test results. She walked us through exposure levels, covenant requirements, something called cross-default triggers that could ripple through all my other loans. But it was the timeline that hit hardest. 30 days to clear everything up, or the credit line would default. "I've known you 30 years, Ray," Sandra said, her professional mask slipping just a bit. "But the bank has procedures. Even with a fraud report, we need this resolved within the cure period." My face felt hot, that special kind of embarrassment that comes from having to clean up someone else's mess in front of people you respect. "What do you need from me?" She pulled out a checklist. Affidavits, police reports, corrected title documentation, proof of fleet locations. "We'll note the pending fraud investigation in the file. Can you come back in 2 weeks with these items?" "We'll have them," Richard answered while I tried to get my voice working again. The morning sun hit us like a slap when we walked out. I checked my watch, just past 11. 30 days minus 3 hours already gone, and a mountain of paperwork ahead. Richard patted the file crate in the back seat. "One step at a time," he said, but we both knew every minute counted now. The bank's glass doors reflected the sunlight behind us, and I caught our reflection. 2 men carrying a box of broken trust, into the heat of a June morning racing a clock we hadn't set. Back home, I cleared Eleanor's china from the dining table. We hadn't used it since that disastrous brunch, and spread the bank documents across the dark wood. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows over papers that told a story I never wanted to read. Richard settled into Eleanor's old chair, legal pad ready. First things first, we need to draft this fraud report. His pen scratched against the yellow paper. Then there's a whole list of folks who need to know: credit bureaus, insurance company, state regulatory board. You ever notice how shame comes in waves? First there's the hot flush when you discover the betrayal, then this cold hollow feeling when you realize how many people have to know about it. Each new name Richard added to his list felt like another witness to my failure as a father. Before we go too far, Richard said, we should take one more pass through the trust documents, map out exactly what powers are assigned where. He pulled out the thick folder of legal papers Eleanor had insisted we review every year. Your wife knew what she was doing, making you keep these current. Remember what I said about shame coming in waves? The third kind is the worst. It's when you start seeing your whole life reduced to signatures and liens. Every fatherly decision tallied up like a balance sheet. The numbers started blurring together as I read through clause after clause. 30 years of building something honest, and here I was, looking for legal weapons against my own son. Richard must have noticed something in my face, because he put his hand flat on the table right next to mine. Ray, he said, his voice gentle but firm, mistakes made from love aren't crimes. You tried to be a good father. My throat felt tight. I just wanted to give him one bright thing for Father's Day. That watch meant something. I could still hear the clang of it hitting the trash can, see Mark's dismissive smirk. Got mocked for my trouble, didn't I? Well, Richard said, underlining something on his pad. Here's what we do next. First, we freeze any unauthorized activity, bank accounts, credit lines, everything. Then we notify Collins about the situation. Get him working on the legal angle. And we need a clean timeline of everything that's happened, every document we've found. I nodded, but Lord, I was tired. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away another hour of our 30 days, and I could feel the weight of time pressing down. 29 days left to save everything I'd built. The phone sat silent on the table, and I couldn't help picturing tomorrow's headlines. Local fleet seized. Family business collapses. Eleanor, I whispered to the empty room. What would you do? Getting up from the table, I walked to the study and slid open the desk drawer where I'd put Harold's watch. The gold felt cool in my palm, solid. The second hand was still ticking along, marking time like it had for 3 generations. But tonight, watching it move felt different, less like comfort, more like countdown. Richard cleared, his throat from the doorway. You know what Eleanor would say. She'd tell you to fight smart, not sad. I set the watch back in its drawer, next to the stack of insurance papers that might save or sink us. 29 days. The house felt too quiet, too big. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder if anything you built really belongs to you at all. Ray, Richard called from the dining room, I think I found something in these trust documents. You might want to see this. When morning rolled around, I'd barely slept. Richard picked me up at 7 sharp and we headed to Collins' office with a timeline I'd stapled together 3 times to get the pages straight. Funny how your hands shake more when you're trying to be extra careful. The wait in Collins' reception area took me back to all those mornings Eleanor and I had sat in these same chairs, planning our future while our kids were still small enough to need babysitters. The leather cushions hadn't changed, and that coffee maker in the corner still made the same gurgling sound. Mr. Whitaker. Collins' assistant ushered us in, and I caught the subtle shift in her expression, the kind you get when someone's heard things but is too professional to let on. Collins stood as we entered, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the morning light. Ray, Richard, please, sit down, he gestured, to the chairs facing his desk, and I noticed he already had a legal pad ready. Tell me what's happening. I laid out our timeline while Richard supplied dates and document copies. Collins listened, his pen moving steadily across the yellow paper, pausing only to ask clarifying questions. When I got to the part about Mark's forged signature at the bank, Collins's writing slowed, and he glanced up sharply. I'd like to see copies of everything. You've found, he said, but first, he set down his pen. I want to review Eleanor's Trust, the original if you have it. Got it right here. I pulled out the hard copy, complete with those blue tabs Eleanor had placed years ago. Some were faded now, but she'd written on each one in her neat hand. She was particular about these tabs, I added. Made me promise to keep them exactly as she'd marked them. You know what it's like when you're watching someone read something important. How you try to guess what they're thinking by the way their eyes move. Well, Collins was giving me plenty to wonder about. He frowned at one paragraph, flipped back several pages, then returned to what looked like a schedule of powers. Richard leaned forward in his chair, and I could tell by the way he straightened that something had caught his attention. Collins turned another page, and there it was, Successor Management Contingency. Ray, Collins said slowly, your Eleanor was quite thorough. He adjusted his glasses. This clause here, it's specifically designed to lock operational control to you if there's any fraud allegation involving an heir. For the first time in days, I felt like I could take a full breath. What exactly does that mean? It means, Richard cut in, scanning the page upside down, that the definitions here match perfectly with what the bank documented. Collins nodded. The trust automatically triggers administrative control without having to wait for court proceedings. The moment that fraud report was filed, this clause activated. He looked up at me. Eleanor built you a safeguard, Ray, a legal fortress, if you will. I sat there thinking about Eleanor at this very desk, that determined look she'd get when she was protecting our family. All these years later, her pen was still pointing the way forward. So, I said, closing the binder carefully, what message do we take to the bank meeting in 2 weeks? Richard and Collins exchanged looks, and I could see the beginning of a plan forming. Maybe Eleanor had known all along that one day we'd need more than just love to keep our family's legacy safe. Back in my study that evening, Richard spread a fresh legal pad across the desk. We need to be surgical about this, Ray. No room for emotion to muddy the waters. Agreed. I settled into my chair, fighting the urge to reach for the phone where Mark's last message still waited unanswered. What's first? Collins files the fraud report officially tomorrow morning. Bank gets copied, but we stay quiet until the follow-up meeting. Richard sketched out a timeline in his precise accountant's hand. We let the documentation do the heavy lifting. You ever notice how planning revenge isn't nearly as satisfying as those movies make it seem? Mostly it's just paperwork and waiting, but Richard had a way of making even paperwork feel like justice in motion. I've color-coded the exhibit packets, he continued, pulling out a stack of folders. Blue tabs for signature samples. See how Mark's forgery matches up against your real ones? Red for the fleet titles he tried to leverage. Yellow for the trust clause excerpts. I nodded, remembering Eleanor's own careful tab system. She'd appreciate the organization. Richard smiled briefly. Now, we need to work on your delivery. Everything needs to sound factual, not personal. Want to practice? Standing in front of my bathroom mirror that night, I rehearsed the key phrases we'd crafted. Yes, that's my company's fleet inventory. Pause. No, I didn't authorize this application. Another pause. This signature here, it's not mine. Simple statements, no heat behind them, just the truth served cold. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Hey Dad, some exciting meeting opportunities coming up. Let's grab lunch soon? I set the phone face down without replying. You know that feeling when you're fishing, and you know the fish is circling your bait? That's what this was. Mark thought he had me swimming toward his hook, but he couldn't see the net we'd positioned underneath. The bank's calendar invite arrived precisely at noon. Follow-up meeting RE Fleet Credit Line application. Conference room 3B. Attendees: Raymond Whitaker, Richard Morton, Compliance Officer Sarah Chen. Each name felt like another brick in the wall Mark had built around himself. Richard came by that afternoon with the final reconciliation of the fleet titles. Let's double-check every VIN number, he said, spreading the documents across my kitchen table, the same table where Mark had tossed away my father's watch just 2 weeks ago. We can't leave any gaps for questions. We worked through the list methodically, the afternoon light fading as we verified each truck's documentation. The familiar rhythm of paperwork helped steady my hands, but my throat felt tight with everything left unsaid. Save your voice. For the meeting, Richard advised, gathering up the verified files. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's going to require every ounce of composure you've got. After he left, I sat in the quiet of my study. The watch, cleaned now and running perfectly, sat on my desk where I'd placed it that morning. I wound it carefully 2 full turns and listened to its tick grow stronger and more consistent, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. The sound took me back to watching my father check this same watch every morning before heading to work. "Time waits for no man, Ray," he'd say, "but a man can sure make time work for him if he's patient enough." I flicked off the study light and stood in the darkness for a moment, picturing tomorrow's meeting. The conference room door handle cool under my palm, the weight of Richard's folders in my other hand, the tick of the watch in my pocket, keeping perfect time. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration, setting things right. And sometimes setting things right requires nothing more than letting the truth speak for itself. My phone buzzed again, probably another text from Mark, but I left it there in the dark. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, all the words that needed saying. The morning sun blazed through the bank's glass doors as we walked in, Richard carrying 2 thick binders and Attorney Collins trailing behind with his recorder. My father's watch ticked steadily in my pocket, a reminder that time was finally on my side. You know those moments when your whole life narrows down to a single room? That's what it felt like stepping into conference room 3B. The air conditioning hummed too loud, and the leather chairs squeaked against the polished floor as we settled. In Ms. Chen, the compliance officer, sat ramrod straight in her charcoal suit, while the branch manager, Tom Phillips, adjusted his reading glasses. The fluorescent lights made everyone look a shade paler than natural. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," Phillips said, sliding a thick manila folder across the gleaming mahogany. "We appreciate you coming in to address these irregularities." The folder made a soft scratching sound as it moved. Inside were the documents that could either save or sink everything I'd built. Funny how a lifetime's work can fit in something so slim. "For the record," Attorney Collins began, pressing the recorder's red button, "we're here to review loan application documents submitted under Raymond Whitaker's name. Present are myself, James Collins, Richard Morton, CPA, Compliance Officer Sarah Chen, Branch Manager Thomas Phillips, and Mr. Raymond Whitaker." I cleared my throat. "I'd like to examine the signatures, if I may." Richard opened the first binder, removing a sheet protected in clear plastic. "These are Mr. Whitaker's verified signatures from the past 5 years of corporate filings." He placed it beside the loan guarantee, and even from across the table the differences jumped out like neon signs. "Notice the pressure points here," Richard said, using a pencil to indicate specific spots. "Natural signatures maintain consistent pressure. These strokes break unnaturally, typical of traced or studied forgery." The room felt heavier as Attorney Collins pulled out a blue folder. "We've filed a formal fraud report with the appropriate authorities." He adjusted his reading glasses. "Additionally, I'd like to direct everyone's attention to the Successor Management Contingency Clause in the original trust documents." The sound of papers shuffling filled the silence as he found the right page. "Upon credible allegation of fraud or malfeasance by any heir or beneficiary," he read, "operational control of all trust assets reverts immediately and solely to the grantor Raymond Whitaker, without requirement of judicial intervention." Phillips removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Given the evidence presented and our internal policies, we'll need to freeze the credit line pending full resolution." The clock on the wall ticked past 9:15. My palms were dry despite everything, and I found myself running my thumb across the watch in my pocket. The second hand kept moving, steady and sure, just like Eleanor had taught me, one step at a time, no matter how hard the path. At 9:22, the door swung open. Mark sauntered in, his tie already loose at the collar. That familiar smirk played across his face as he dropped into an empty chair, looking for all the world like he was joining a casual lunch meeting. "Sorry I'm late," he said, not sounding sorry at all. Traffic was murder. Phillips didn't smile back. Instead, he turned the loan application so it faced Mark, his finger resting on the signature line. "Mr. Whitaker, the younger, would you care to explain this signature? For the record, please." I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. The watch ticked softly in my pocket, counting down the seconds until Mark would have to speak, until he'd have to explain away what couldn't be explained. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A phone rang distantly in the bank lobby. And in that sterile conference room, surrounded by evidence and witnesses, I watched my son's smirk fade as he stared at his own handiwork. Mark let out a laugh that sounded like wind through empty rooms. "Come on, there's obviously been some misunderstanding here." He spread his hands wide, that politician's smile still playing on his face. Ms. Chen's pen scratched against her notepad. "Noted. Time is 9:24 a.m. Subject claims misunderstanding of signature authenticity." You know that feeling when you've caught someone red-handed and they still think they can talk their way out? I'd seen it before across negotiating tables, but never from my own flesh and blood. "About these margin notations," Phillips said, tapping 3 sets of initials on the loan documents. "They match your email handle, Mr. Whitaker. MWK. Would you care to explain that coincidence?" Mark's smile flickered just a fraction. Lots of people could have those initials. Richard chose that moment to open the second binder. The sound of the rings clicking apart seemed to echo in the quiet room. "I have here," he said, pulling out a printed page. "Email headers from the title company. Messages requesting rushed copies of fleet documentation." He slid the paper forward. "The sender address is mkwhitakeragmail.com. Timestamps matching the loan application period." I watched my son's face as the evidence mounted. It was like watching a house of cards catch a breeze. You know what's coming, but you still can't look away. Attorney Collins cleared his throat. "For the record, the Trust's Successor Management Contingency Clause activates upon credible allegation of fraud. The bank's internal review process has now established such credibility." He looked at Phillips. "The implications are immediate and binding." Phillips nodded, straightening in his chair. "Given the documentation presented and our compliance requirements, we are suspending the credit line, effective immediately." He turned to me, his voice steady. "Operational control of Whitaker Transport remains solely with Raymond Whitaker, per the trust provisions." Something left my hands then, a tremor I hadn't even noticed until it was gone, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying since that Father's Day brunch. The watch in my pocket felt warm against my leg. "Mr. Phillips," Ms. Chen said, "the temporary control forms are ready for processing. Perhaps we should have the younger Mr. Whitaker step out while we complete the paperwork." Phillips nodded. "Mark, if you'd please wait in the lobby." "This is ridiculous." Mark's chair scraped back. "You can't just—" "We can and we are," Phillips cut in. "Please, step out." Ms. Chen stood and opened the conference room door. Mark's face had gone from politician smooth to thunder dark as he stalked toward the hallway. His voice carried back, sharp against the marble floors. The side door clicked shut, muffling the commotion outside. I could hear him out there, voice rising and falling like a bad radio signal. "These forms," Phillips said, sliding fresh papers across the table, "will confirm temporary control protocols. We'll need to schedule a follow-up to process the complete transfer of the credit line." I picked up the pen, its weight familiar in my hand. The signature flowed smooth and natural. No broken strokes, no hesitation. Richard nodded as I completed each page, checking boxes and initialing where indicated. Through the door's frosted glass, I could see Mark's shadow pacing. His voice carried through, words I never thought I'd hear from a son to his father. "You'll regret this, old man." But the only regret in that room was his, though he didn't know it yet. I signed the last page and handed it back to Phillips, who nodded with something like respect in his eyes. The watch ticked steadily in my pocket as Ms. Chen gathered the forms for processing. Some things, I thought, keep better time than others. Some things stay true, no matter how many hands try to wind them differently. The drive home felt like floating through someone else's dream. You know what I mean? When everything looks normal, the trees, the traffic lights, the bank signs, but nothing quite settles right in your mind. Richard kept quiet in the passenger seat, shuffling papers back into his briefcase. The midday sun turned the hood into a mirror, and I could feel the heat pushing through the windshield, even with the air conditioning running full blast. The tires hummed against asphalt, a steady drone that almost matched my heartbeat. "Give it 48 hours, Richard said finally, breaking the silence as we turned onto Oak Street. "Let the bank notices do their work. Sometimes the quietest voice carries furthest." I nodded, hands steady at 10 and 2, the same way I'd taught Mark to drive, back when he was 16 and eager to prove himself. The memory stung like salt in a fresh cut. My phone buzzed in the console. Local number, not one I recognized. Raymond Whitaker speaking, I answered, putting it on speaker. Mr. Whitaker, Jim Preston from the Business Journal. The voice was professional, practiced. I'm following up on a personnel ethics review at Midwest Development. I understand your son Mark— No comment, I cut in, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. Thank you for calling. I ended the call and glanced at Richard. His eyebrows had climbed halfway up his forehead. Well, he said quietly. That didn't take long. We pulled into my driveway just as another text lit up my phone. A name I recognized. Pete Miller, who'd worked with Mark for years. The message was brief. HR meeting at 3. Bad. My hands weren't quite as steady now as I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. The wall clock above the sink ticked away, each second distinct and heavy. Remember those old educational films where they'd show dominoes falling in slow motion? That's what this felt like, watching the inevitable chain reaction, unable to stop it even if I'd wanted to. The kitchen felt too warm, too still. I found myself counting heartbeats, waiting for— what? Mark's car in the driveway, another phone call, the other shoe dropping. The garage door motor whirred to life, and I braced myself. But it was just Mrs. Peterson next door, backing out for her weekly bridge game. The sound faded, leaving that thick afternoon silence again. When the phone buzzed this time, I already knew what I'd find. Another text from Pete. Terminated for cause. Turn-in badge. Just like that. 6 words ending a career built on shortcuts and sharp elbows, the kind of fall that echoes through business circles for years. I walked to the window. Heavy clouds were rolling in from the west, banking up over rooftops like waves about to break. The temperature had dropped just enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. The house keys felt heavy in my pocket as I weighed what to do next. Should I call him? Leave a message? Sometimes silence speaks volumes all on its own. The watch ticked steadily against my hip, keeping time while the world shifted around us. Richard gathered his briefcase, pausing by the door. Want me to stay? I shook my head. This part I need to handle alone. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Call if you need anything, day or night. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me with the ticking clock and my thoughts. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, drawing dark circles on the driveway. Chapter 12. Scene 1. 2 days later, I pulled into the bank's parking lot, right as the morning rush was tapering off. Funny how normal everything looked. Same flagpole catching the breeze, same potted plants flanking the entrance. But nothing felt the same. Not really. Richard met me at the door, leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Ready? As I'll ever be. My voice came out steadier than I expected. The compliance officer, Janet Myers, according to her nameplate, had everything laid out on the conference room table when we walked in. Neat stacks of papers, color-coded tabs, even fresh pens still in their plastic wrap. The kind of organization that speaks of things being done properly, permanently. Mr. Whitaker, she nodded, gesturing to the chair at the head of the table. Let's make this thorough. For the next 2 hours, we went through everything line by line. I signed releases dissolving the fraudulent credit line, initialed confirmations that my fleet titles remained untouched, dated each piece of paper that proved my company was mine alone. These are your copies of the fraud designation, Janet said, sliding a blue folder across the polished wood. The application has been permanently marked as fraudulent, with all appropriate agencies notified. I opened the folder, saw Mark's failed scheme laid bare in official language. Black and white, no room for interpretation. The kind of paper trail that follows a man forever in the banking world. Richard leaned over, checking each page with the attention to detail that had helped build his accounting practice. Everything's in order, he confirmed quietly. Clean as Eleanor would want it. That brought a lump to my throat I hadn't expected. Eleanor had always said good bookkeeping was just another word for honesty. Is there anything else you need from us? Janet asked, her pen poised over the final checklist. I shook my head. I believe we're done here. The drive home felt different from 2 days ago. The late afternoon sun was sliding toward dusk, painting everything in soft gold, like the world was letting out a long-held breath. Back in my study, I opened the drawer where I'd kept the watch since rescuing it from the trash. Amazing how something so small could carry so much weight. I lifted it into the lamplight, watching the gold catch and hold the glow. The face was clear now, each number distinct against the cream-colored dial. Sliding the band around my wrist, I felt the cool metal warm against my skin. The tick-tick-tick settled into rhythm with my pulse, steady, sure, unshakable. Just like Eleanor would have wanted, just like she'd known I'd need someday. On my desk, the day's paperwork showed everything in black and white, assets secure, company intact, and there on my tablet, the local business page's personnel updates column with its terse announcement. Mark Whitaker no longer with Midwest Development, effective immediately. The air coming through the study window carried the sharp green smell of fresh-cut grass. Somewhere, down the street, a diesel engine turned over and faded. One of my trucks heading out for the night run, right on schedule. I walked out to the porch, feeling the evening settle around me. The watch caught the last light as I raised my wrist, watching the second hand sweep past 12, each tick marking off another moment in this new chapter. You know what Eleanor used to say about respect? That it's like a garden. You can't demand things to grow. You can only plant the seeds and tend them properly. Looking at that steady second hand moving forward, I knew she'd been right all along. The watch ticked on, keeping perfect time. Just like my father had promised it would, just like I'd tried to tell Mark before he threw it away. Sitting there in the gathering dusk, I finally understood the lesson completely. Respect is earned, never demanded.